Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. So Yvonne and I are part of a two-person team who John has brought in to help with the rollout of the guide. So we were involved in looking at the draft, and also we'll be there to review the first attempts that you have at actually rolling out the economic assessments of your policies. So we're just wanting to give you a brief overview of the broad contents of the guide without going into too much detail. So this is a roughly 30-minute presentation. If economics isn't your bag, I hope you have lots of coffee beside you to keep you going through this. So in terms of what we're going to talk about, we just wanted to give a little bit of background in terms of the project and also where the economic guide fits into the project. Talk about the organization of the guide and the key steps. And then we want to hone in on a couple of key issues. One is what we're referring to as a with and without framework. Then we'll look at values, uncertainty, and the use of case studies. And then finally, support which is available. So that's the broad plan. John's already described the GloFouling project, so I feel like I'm just going to repeat what he says here. But as he has indicated, the project is ultimately to help countries roll out the IMO biofouling guidelines and any other guidelines to help manage biofouling and its impacts, and ultimately look at reducing invasive species arising from biofouling and any of the harm that it brings along.
So the project has 5 themes of outputs, and economic analysis of biofouling strategies or policies fits within this institutional package. And I just want to look at that in a little bit of detail here. So as John indicated, the first step in this institutional package is about national status assessments. So this is really the reports which say what are the kind of threats from biofouling and invasive species to our countries and the kind of impacts that we're concerned about. And those hopefully are underway, if not already close to completion. And then based on that, the development of national biofouling strategies or policies. Then we come to the purpose of this workshop today, which is about doing a rapid cost benefit analysis of those strategies to kind of present a business case to policymakers that it's worth investing in the strategies. So what's particular about this activity is the focus on a rapid economic assessment. For anyone who's been involved in doing economic assessments in the past, you have my deep sympathies. And I'm sure that you can agree that doing an economic assessment is actually quite an onerous activity. It's quite data demanding. Often that data is really hard to find, so you have to spend a lot of time trying to chase it down. It may take a whole different set of people that you have to bug and be little fleas in their ear and ask for help. So it's quite a demanding activity. And not all countries have the time or the people or the resources to be able to do a detailed economic analysis of a proposed policy or strategy. So we're trying to streamline the activity, but remain as consistent as possible in an economic analysis. And in streamlining that activity, we are also including in the guide potential case studies that you could borrow or amend to support your economic analysis. And we'll go more into that later. I can't see you all whilst I'm presenting, so can I ask you to unmute and squeak very loudly if you don't know what a cost-benefit analysis is. And it's okay, this is not a test. If you don't know what a cost-benefit analysis is, can you yell into your microphone so I know that you're out there? It's very quiet. You're either very shy.
This is very quiet, but you can also use the chat if you feel very shy to shout something.
Very shy or very knowledgeable. Okay. If there's anyone out there who is just super shy and doesn't want to say anything, a cost-benefit analysis is basically just a framework for weighing up the pros and cons of doing something. And intuitively, we do this ourselves every day. This morning, I didn't want to get out of bed because it's cold and foggy in the part of New Zealand where I live. And so it's very tempting to stay in bed and skip breakfast so I can get a few more minutes of sleep. But then I have to weigh that benefit up against the fact that if I get up late, I have to do without breakfast, and then I come to the office and I get hungry and distracted. Then I raid the vending machine, which is full of junk and costs me money. So I weigh that up and then I go, okay, I'll get out of bed. So really, a cost-benefit analysis is just about weighing up the pros and cons of whether or not to do something. And in this case, it's the pros and cons of investing in a national strategy or policy for biofouling. And a formalized cost-benefit analysis then measures up those pros and cons, or those benefits and losses, excuse me, and expresses them in dollar terms so that we can see if the benefits exceed the costs and what the payoff is. When we talk about cost-benefit analysis in the context of a biofouling policy, there are certain benefits that we would potentially be gaining from having a biofouling policy. So this could include, for instance, direct industry benefits. So by preventing invasive aquatic species, we might protect our fishing industry and protect our profits. We might have environmental benefits. Excuse me. We might have environmental benefits. We protect our assets, our ecosystems. We protect public health because we don't have sullying of the environment. We don't have more invasive species which are harmful. We protect our assets into the future. And that may mean that some of the things that we're not using now, some of the environmental assets we're not using now, are protected. And into the future, we might go, thank God we introduced that biofouling policy, because that means we've protected our coral reefs and we can use them for these new purposes. This is called option values. And ultimately, by preventing the entry of invasive species, we may also be having benefits in terms of our recreation and our cultural activities. So there's lots of different types of benefits that ultimately we might be including in our economic analysis, depending on the industries that we are protecting. I wanted to talk about policy development. If you've been involved in policy development, you know that most of the time and effort in developing the strategy and the policy are incurred upfront. So you spend a lot of time doing public consultations, having brainstorming workshops, drafting out stuff, putting out the draft strategy to the public, having everybody rubbish the draft strategy, going back and then refining it, and then trying to execute it and enforce it over time. So we tend to end up with this kind of flow of costs over time, with most of the costs incurred upfront and then implementation and compliance costs over time. And that's a little bit different from when we get the benefits, because when we're developing the policy or the strategy, of course, we're not getting anything out of it because we're still spending time formulating it. And then we start to implement, and it takes a little while for everyone to start towing the line and complying. And eventually we get into a rhythm and we get all our benefits. So we have a bit of a mismatch here. And with the cost benefit analysis, what we're going to try and do is isolate these differences, add them up over time, and then say, well, look, if our benefits exceed our costs over time, we have a strong business case to go to policymakers saying, if you give us the money to do this policy, we are going to make savings which far exceed that. And they go, oh, okay, that sounds like a reasonable argument. If, however, we do our economic analysis and we show that the costs of doing this strategy exceed the benefits, we have a weak business case. And we have to think about other ways then to protect the environment from the biofouling. Now, it might be that we just have to redesign the strategy. It might be that we have to do more things in the economic analysis. It's a number of things, but it gives us the basis for that argument or that dialogue with policymakers. The guide that you've been sent is a draft, and there are 4 main components to it. The first one is general introductory stuff, some key economic concepts. The second part is about the steps in a rapid economic assessment, in a rapid cost benefit analysis of your strategies or policies. And I'll take you through those steps in a minute. The third part of the guide is the majority of the document, and it is details of individual sectors in your marine economies that might be affected by biofouling and who might benefit from the introduction of a policy, and it gives the details of how you might quantify those benefits to those sectors. And then part 4 is basically additional information. So we have in the guide 13 sectors covered in detail, varying degrees of detail, and how you might quantify the benefits of having a biofouling strategy in your countries. So what are the benefits to the shipping industry of having a biofouling policy? What are the benefits to the tourism sector of having a biofouling policy? And all of the details are in the chapters on these individual sectors. Now, it is possible that in your countries, there is another major sector affected by biofouling, which is not included in the guide, and that would be really important to include those benefits to that sector of a biofouling policy or strategy. If we have missed a major sector for your country, please reach out to us and let us know, and then we can have a think about how we can assist you to value that. Because there is so much here in the presentation today, we're not going to go into any detail of it. I invite you all to look at the guide and to think about the sectors relevant to your countries. If we tried to go through the entire guide today, you'd still be here at Christmas. So we're just going to, that's just to give you a flavor of what's in there. Okay, steps for doing a rapid cost-benefit analysis. I can see you excited and you're leaping in your seats at this point. Yes, I can see you chuckling. So, step 1, getting your team together. Generally speaking, in an economic analysis, I would say, please have an economist, but not all countries have economists just lying around the place available to join the team. If you can find one on the street, nab it, bring it home. Okay, so you want an economist in your team, if at all possible. It would be really valuable to have someone extremely familiar with the marine sector and potentially different sectors in the marine economy, like fisheries. You do need somebody who's quantitative. And the more numbers you have, the more quantitative they need to be, and somebody who can write. So these reports, we have a template for them to write up the results of your economic analysis. My experience, and it might just be that I'm a bad writer, but my experience is that policymakers don't want to read documents. So you will have the document there with all the summary in, but what you have to do is actually make a compelling oral argument to them as well. So you will have to have good communicators in your team. Step 2, determine the scope, and that's really about thinking about which sectors in your countries are likely to be being harmed or will be harmed by biofouling, and then which of those sectors are then going to benefit from having a biofouling policy. And it may be quite different from one country to the next. Identifying your benefits and costs. So when you have decided which sectors you need to focus on, then you can think about, well, so how is my fisheries sector going to be affected, or how is my shipping sector going to be affected by biofouling or the introduction of invasive aquatic species, so that you can get a sense qualitatively, descriptively, of the types of effects that biofouling would have on them. And then the lion's share of the work comes in step 4, gathering the data and assessing values. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Calculating economic metrics, basically telling decision makers what the costs of biofouling are, what the savings are that you would get from your biofouling strategy, and what the payoff is. Looking at socioeconomic impacts. Now, we haven't included this in the presentation, so as a spoiler alert, we are boiling down socioeconomic assessment in the guide to a gender analysis and a qualitative distributional analysis. There are tables for this. It's quite straightforward, it's quite minimalistic, but by all means go further if you have the time and the resources. Validating results, checking that what you produce seems reasonable, and then interpreting and putting the results into a report. That's all very exciting, isn't it? The real lion's share of the work comes into step 4 in terms of trying to get the data to come up with some values. And there are 4 sets of values ultimately that we're going to be thinking about to demonstrate the value of a biofouling strategy or policy. The first one is, what are the costs to our country now and into the future of continuing without a biofouling policy or strategy. Okay. The second one is what would be the costs from biofouling and associated invasive aquatic species into the future if we did have a policy. And because having a policy incurs costs, what would be the costs of having that policy to industry and complying with the policy? And what would be the costs to government of enforcing it and actually generating the policy to begin with? So what's important here is that we are going to look for values, costs of biofouling and invasive aquatic species without policy, and the costs with a policy. So with a strategy and without a strategy. And that's fundamental to a cost benefit analysis. And it's referred to as a with and without framework. And what we are trying to do is describe the world, your country, with a biofouling policy or strategy and compare it to the world without one. Now, without a biofouling strategy or policy, you have ongoing costs over time, possibly escalating, of biofouling and invasive aquatic species. And what we would anticipate is that a successful biofouling strategy would have lower costs. But you have to develop the policy and execute it and enforce it. Industry has to comply, so there are costs in there as well. And ultimately, what we're looking to prove is that your biofouling policy is going to actually be less costly than continuing into the future without one. So when we talk about the costs of biofouling and invasive aquatic species over time, what are we talking about? So biofouling, the biggest cost is likely to be the introduction of invasive aquatic species. Okay, so these unwanted passengers creeping in and then imposing costs on industries. However, there's also some sectors that directly suffer from biofouling. So for instance, the shipping industry from extra cleaning and drag on hauls and so on. So there are two sets of costs related to biofouling. So the costs of invasive species and the costs of biofouling management generally. And those are your total costs of biofouling over time. And when you do your economic analysis, you'll be looking at those costs without your strategies and with your strategies. That's your with and without framework. So if we think about the costs of biofouling and invasive aquatic species over time, every year that we're not tackling this problem, the costs are occurring. Okay, so what we end up with is this costs occurring over time. And what we would hope is that if we introduce a strategy or policy, those costs would actually be lower. And in an absolutely perfect world, we'd actually have no invasive species at all, for instance. So our savings are the costs avoided. In practice, it may be that our policy or our strategy doesn't completely remove all costs, but it certainly lowers them. And we're looking to then value these savings. Where will we get information on our without policy world, the world as we know it now without our strategy? You do hopefully have your national assessments to draw on. If they're not completed, go to the person who's completing them and say, please help us. So those assessments basically tell us what kind of threats we have out there, the kind of impacts that we're dealing with into the future. It also contains information on sources of information and references for elsewhere. National statistics departments and ministries and universities, your national task force, also have access to information and may have suggestions for where to look, to sit there and say, well, the cost to the fishing industry, you know, we have these kind of effects. You need to think about these. When we look overseas, there are databases elsewhere, and we are going to come back to the issue of databases in a minute because it's a helpful corner cutting exercise. Case studies, expert opinion, but only opinions from actual experts, not the person who just happens to be sitting in the room at the time when the person you really want to speak to is away. And where we can't actually value the world into the future without a policy, we can sit there and say, well, this is what we think it's going to look like, and we think it's going to be big or small, and this is why. Now, when we have numbers, we can use them in the cost benefit analysis. When we don't, those numbers will not be included in the values you produce. Okay, this is going to be missing, but it could be really important. So if we didn't include the protection of the environment and the benefits to the environment of introducing a biofouling strategy, it could be really, really important. But if we don't have the values for it, that's significant. So that will still be noted in the report, even if it doesn't have a number. Okay. In terms of what does the world look like with a policy or a strategy, look at previous national experiences of managing invasive, at managing aquatic species or at managing the environment, case studies from within your country or from elsewhere, expert opinion. Talk to the people who know and who are already dealing with the problem or trying to keep invasive species out. What do they think this policy would do? What difference would it make? And where you don't know, describe and list and say if you think it's going to be important or not. I'm going to hand over to the lovely Yvonne now. So I'm going to go quiet and Yvonne is going to tell me when to click.
Thanks, Paula, and good morning or good evening, everyone again. So as Paula said, compiling the necessary data is usually the most difficult step in doing a CBA, and there are definitely going to be gaps in the information or limitations, and these limitations can make it unclear whether the policy is actually going to pay off or not. So then the key question becomes, how reliable does an assessment need to be to ensure the policy will be effective? And then what level of uncertainty is unacceptable to decision makers? So we're suggesting that it's useful to categorize the problems with the information because this has implications on whether you can deal with them or how you might reduce them. So there are 4 types of issues here. The first one is volatility, and that's where we know there's a risk, but we can't predict where or when it's going to happen. So we don't know exactly where or when that incursion is going to happen. The second type is uncertainty, and that's where information exists, but it's not available to decision makers. So maybe you don't know how many boats are going through a particular area, or maybe you don't know what kind of economic activity is relying on that marine resource. The third type of limitation is complexity, and that comes down to the fact that we're only considering a small part of a very interconnected system. So biofouling policy is just a small part of overall marine management, and there are implications from other policies on the risk of incursion. And the fourth type of limitation with information is ambiguity, and that's where information doesn't exist because the situation hasn't occurred yet. It might be a completely new pest to the region, or there might be an industry that's in your area that isn't in other areas affected by that pest. So if the cost-benefit analysis is deemed to be too unreliable, you can actually reduce the first 3 problems by throwing more time and money at it. So for number 1, you could do more detailed risk modelling. For number 2, you could go out and collect more information with surveys or interviews or site visits. It's usually quite expensive to do that. For number 3, you could expand the CBA scope to include more interconnected parts, more different policies, maybe more sectors, more different ecosystems. Again, that's going to cost time and money. But for the 4th type, there's really nothing you can do to improve the reliability of the assessment. So you're going to have to make that decision anyway. You just have to decide whether that's important for whether your policy is going to be effective or not. So to help you try and fill some of those information gaps, GloFouling have developed this database. Oh, sorry, next slide. There's a database of case studies which might help you. So this database contains a list of case studies where the effect of biofouling on sectors has been described or valued. So that's what the front end looks like. So if you just click on the next one, yes, so you can see, oh, probably I think this is the ecosystem services valuation study. So this captures the value of the environmental goods or services that might be affected. So this one here, it tells you the type of area where the species where there's been an assessment done, what kind of industry, the monetary unit used, what year it is, and a few other details. So that can be quite useful. And this green page here, it tells you what type of ecosystem has been affected, what's been valued, how it's been valued, and again, some values if they're available. So the database focuses in particular on environmental services affected by biofouling or biofouling related IAS. So this is the area where your data is likely to be especially lacking. Next slide. So when you're using case studies or transferring values from other studies, there's kind of a hierarchy of types of case studies that might be available. So the first example here, if the species has been identified in the country and an impact assessment is available and quantified, that means you've already got your baseline information. And then all you need to do is calculate the impact of the policy. The second level, maybe the species has been identified and an impact assessment has been done, but there's no quantification. So that's where you need to use that impact assessment and try and put some numbers around it by using market prices, market impacts, and calculate those non-market values using local values if they're available, or if not, then you'll need to use a case study from another location if it's similar enough. At the third level, so the species has been identified in the country or region, but no impact assessment has been done. So in this situation, you need to look at those case studies from other regions to determine if there's been an impact assessment for that species for a similar industry, if the study areas are similar enough. And again, you'll have to calculate market impacts using local prices, and then non-market impact using non-market values if available, or case study values if they're not available. And finally, if the species hasn't been identified in the country or region, but maybe you've got an industry that's in your region that's been identified as having high exposure or national significance. So then you need to do all of above, but also due to the high level of uncertainty, you might use an assumed 0.25 invasion risk for that species. So we're just suggesting that as a rule of thumb. You might have a better value available. Next slide. So when you're taking values from another case study, there's a few steps you'll need to do to adjust it to the local context. Firstly, the value might have been from a study that was done several years ago, in which case you'll need to convert it to current terms by using a measure of inflation or perhaps a producer's price index. Secondly, it might not be in your currency, so then you need to convert it using exchange rates. And thirdly, it might be a non-local value that comes from quite a different economy. Maybe you're transferring value from a low-income area to a high-income area, in which case you'll probably want to adjust for purchasing power parity. And then once you've done those adjustments, then hopefully you can use that value in your cost-benefit analysis. Next slide. So Paula noted earlier that most investments, they have the costs quite early on, whereas the benefits might not manifest for quite some time. This mismatch across time is important because people are impatient. We value costs or benefits accrued today more than those incurred in the future. So if those benefits are a long way in the future, it's harder to sell the policies to the decision makers. We call this having a positive time preference, and it's generally an accepted concept in CBA. The practice of accounting for this time preference is called discounting, and it involves expressing those future costs and benefits of a policy in terms of their present value. It's the reverse, the formula involves using the reverse of a compounding interest rate. So this formula itself is not too difficult to apply. You can do it in Excel. What is really important is the selection of the discount rate. So that's the factor by which you convert those future values to appear in present day terms. Different governments or organisations will often have guidelines on what is an appropriate discount rate to use for a project that has public benefits or environmental benefits, or it might be linked to your organisation's cost of capital. As interest rates go up, then those future benefits become less valuable. So we can't tell you what discount rate to use, but it's usually a good idea to do some sensitivity analysis around that discount rate and see how high the rate needs to be before a policy no longer pays off. Next slide. So if you're doing this Excel and this CBA in Excel, you might set it up by having a row with all your present value benefits. So those are your benefits that are discounted over time. And then below that, you can put all your costs and subtract one from the other. And that's your net present value. So if your net present value is greater than 0, that's a good business case for the policy. Obviously, the higher it is, the better. If it's less than 0, that implies there's a weak business case for policy. So that's when you need to think about whether maybe there are some benefits that haven't been quantified. How significant are those likely to be? Could those be enough that if they could be quantified, then they would make the NPV greater than 0? So the greater the NPV, the more efficient is the outcome, meaning that more benefits are generated from the costs of the policy. Next slide. So after you've calculated those economic metrics, the net present value, the next step is to validate the results. Firstly, you want to do some reality testing. This means taking some of those really significant values from the analysis and comparing them to known values to see if they look logical or reasonable. For example, the total estimated cost of biofouling for a sector, you might compare that to the total value added or output of that sector. If it's quite a large proportion of value added, then you might be asking yourself, is that reasonable? Does that look realistic? Secondly, you definitely want to do some sensitivity analysis. Where major assumptions or shortcuts have been used, you might want to apply different values that are still reasonable, but maybe they're higher or lower than the values used originally, to identify whether the conclusion remains the same. So does the business case still look good if you change those assumptions? A good value, a good parameter to use for a sensitivity analysis is the discount rate. But also you might look at some of those values that can't be quantified. How high would they actually have to be before your net present value becomes positive? And does that seem feasible that they might be worth that much? Finally, it's often a good idea to do a peer review, especially where an economist is not part of your assessment team. And so then you might get the CBA reviewed by an economist if one can be accessed. Next slide. So we've proposed a reporting template to include all the main findings of the CBA that we've discussed, including where to state your major assumptions and economic metrics and validation of results, and the distributional and gender analysis and the implications of these for the business case. We're proposing up to 10 pages. Of course, you don't have to use the reporting template as it's provided. It's just a guide that might help you check that you've got everything covered. So there's a few limitations to this type of rapid economic assessment. The benefit is you don't need to have specialist knowledge of economics. You don't need to be able to work out non-market values or use those non-market valuation methods yourself. But you do need to understand the assumptions and uncertainties and limitations of the methods that have been used to produce those values in the case studies that you're transferring. And if the uncertainties are so large that it's questionable whether a policy has a positive net benefit or not, a more detailed assessment might still be needed. So if your rapid analysis tells you that it's definitely going to pay off, then that's great. You probably don't need to do any further economic analysis. But if it's looking a bit borderline, then you might still want to do a more detailed assessment or get it reviewed or collect more information. So Paula and I are available to answer your questions when you're doing your analysis. So yeah, we're here to provide support as needed. And that's it for our presentation. Thank you.